have to write an equation for this given graph. Unless it's telling me specifically to write a cosine equation or a sine equation, we actually have options right here. So kind of whatever you see. Do you see a cosine cycle up here? Do you see a sine cycle up here? For example, I could say, oh, here's a cosine cycle right there. And there's my cosine cycle. Maybe we're looking at this and saying, well, you know what, I see a sine cycle, and it's going to start here and end there. So maybe we could write an equation for that. Another possibility is, what if I see a cosine cycle that has been reflected and started at the bottom instead of at the top? Or maybe we saw a reflected sine cycle starting and ending there. So you have options. I'm going to go ahead and choose, I'll just go ahead and choose this cosine cycle so I can talk about some shifting. So I'm going to write an equation for that cycle. Again, I already said it was a cosine, so I know that I will have cosine in my equation. Now the amplitude is going to be a couple ways to think about it. Normally our graph is centered around the x-axis. I can draw in kind of this midline halfway through our graph. That is your new x-axis. We can tell from here the amplitude from this line up to the top of our graph or to the bottom of our graph. It looks like two spaces, but if we pay attention to how they labeled the graph, it's actually one. So I know the amplitude will be 1. Another way to think about it is you can look at the total height. So our graph from the very top to the very bottom, if you take that total distance of 2 and cut it in half, that will give you your amplitude every time also. So however you choose to look at it, our amplitude is 1. Now the period is going to be from the start of the cycle to the end of the cycle. How long did it take to do that? So from here to here. You can kind of count up. Counting up, it's 8 spaces, which is going to be a 2 pi on our graph, I think. Yep, that looks good. So our period is 2 pi. Now I'm actually going to backtrack for a second. When we said the amplitude was 1, that meant that our A value is 1. Now the period is 2 pi, and we need to know what the B value is, because it's the A value and the B value that actually go into your equation. If you can remember, the period formula is 2 pi over B. And so what did you divide 2 pi by in order to get just this 2 pi? So it must have been a 2 pi over a 1 to equal the period that we got from the graph. So our B value is equal to 1. Horizontal shift, well, you know, when you have a graph with no shifting for a cosine, it always starts right on the y-axis, so we need to know how far over did it shift. So your horizontal shift is going to be, you know, from here to here, and that's 2 spaces, which is a pi over 2. And to land where our cycle landed, we did shift to the left, pi over 2. What that means is our C value is going to be a pi over 2, and then we'll talk about whether or not it should be plus or minus when we remember that it got shifted to the left. Your vertical shift, we can tell what the vertical shift is by looking at where our new x-axis landed, that midline. From the original up to this new line, that is your vertical shift. So how many spaces is that? By what they're counting by, we can see it went up 2. Alright, so writing the equation starts out easy with y equals. With your vertical shift, you can put it at the beginning or at the end of your graph. It doesn't matter. Maybe I'll throw it off on the end, which means I'm going to start with the amplitude. The amplitude is 1. You can write the 1 in there and not write it in. I'll go ahead and write it in just because I'm talking about it. Next comes your sine or cosine. So this is a cosine graph. Because we have shifting, we know that we're going to shift within the parentheses, but remember that B value goes in front of the parentheses. So a 1 times the cosine of, and again, that 1 is optional. It kind of looks a little bit weird here. I'll rewrite it again, but that is where your B value goes. And then we're going to do, is it going to be x plus or x minus this pi over 2? Because we're going to the left, and we remember that this is a tricky x, that means there must have been a plus in the equation for this graph to shift to the left, pi over 2. And then our vertical shift, I'm just going to put off on the end here. It is going up 2, so we will have plus 2 hanging out at the end. So without those ones that may be looking a little bit weird, we know our graph is y equals cosine of x plus pi over 2 plus 2.